Following the Civil War, 3 important amendments added to the Constitution. The first is the 13th Amendment. This bans slavery, bans enslavement. There is an important exception, as you just learned about in the movie 13th that you watched. It is still allowed when punishing people for a crime. Next, we have the 14th Amendment. This overturns that terrible Dred Scott decision by granting birth citizenship, meaning that everybody born in this country is a citizen of this country, no matter their race, no matter who their parents are. It also provides equal protection for the law to all people. It provides due process. It also fixes that 3/5 compromise from the original Constitution, and a bunch of other things. And then we have the 15th Amendment. This says that the right to vote shall not be abridged based on race. So in short, we have the 13th banning slavery, the 14th meaning everyone born here is a citizen with equal rights, and the 15th saying that the right to vote is granted to everyone, no matter their race. Following the Civil War in 1865 to 1877, we have the period known as Reconstruction. This is a really important period because it contradicts what we think of as the kind of slow, steady progress in this country. This is where Lincoln begins land reparations, as you will learn about in the racial wealth gap video, to people that have recently been freed as a result of the Civil War in North Carolina. He is then shot dead. The U.S. Army runs elections. Because the Army is actually running the elections, voter suppression becomes very difficult, and the newly granted citizens vote in large numbers. That is to say, the now African American citizens of particularly the former slave states, who, as I mentioned earlier, were often in the majority in many areas, vote. And they vote for a number of important people. Hiram Revels is the first African American U.S. Senator depicted here. In fact, they elect 14 African Americans to the U.S. Congress in total. There are biracial, meaning more than one racial, state governments in 10 states. 600 African Americans are elected total to offices, and they go about instituting improvements to public schools, to the infrastructure, all kinds of good policies. At the same time, Black people start to create a middle class. They start businesses, they become educators, they start schools, they become teachers, they start newspapers, they form civic organizations. If you're the member of a Black fraternity or sorority, there's a good chance that it was started around about this time. This is also when many of the historically Black colleges and universities are started in America. And an important thing to notice about Reconstruction is this directly contradicts one of the major claims that was made justifying slavery, right? One of the things that people said is that, well, people of African descent just weren't able to look after themselves. They were like children. They needed to have white people act as their parents to control them and provide for them. But what we see is that this isn't true at all. That as soon as they're given the opportunity, as soon as they're no longer enslaved, they go about forming mutual support organizations, forming governments, forming public infrastructure, and generally becoming full Americans, part of the new American middle class. Well, not everybody was happy about this. In fact, many white people were very unhappy about it, and it created a massive backlash. The most famous trigger of the backlash was the shooting of Abraham Lincoln. But in general, what happens here is a campaign of terrorism, of lynching, of suppression of Black success in this country, the likes of which we've pretty much never seen. In fact, this is arguably the most successful terrorist campaign in history. There is a large ideology of white supremacy. The Ku Klux Klan is, of course, the most famous example of this, but there's a bunch of different organizations. The film Birth of a Nation, a hugely successful film, is made in 1915. This is a film that's worth seeing just as a historical document, it's really responsible for a lot of the widespread stereotypes and negative ideas that have still been persisted about African Americans, from the fairly trivial, like eating fried chicken, to the severe, like the idea that black men in particular are dangerous rapists. Broadly speaking, the plot of the last part of the movie is that there is a white woman who is being chased by a black man. She runs to a cabin where she is protected. This all takes place in the South, by a former Confederate soldier and a former Union soldier who fight off these armies of black men that are trying to get through the walls. It's actually a scene that was copied in zombie movies later. And then the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan gloriously ride down to save her, to save the white people from these terrible, angry men. And so the idea was the nation that's being born is the unity between the North and the South, between white people of the North and white people of the South, that has been torn apart by the Civil War, which this movie is then blaming on black people, and suggesting that the South is being destroyed by black people. This is also, in some ways, the subplot of Gone with the Wind, or the subtext, of Gone with the Wind, which the president noted lately was a movie he thought should be esteemed. So what's going on here? This is creating a myth that black people were a disaster for the South, that black people couldn't take care of themselves, that the white supremacists like the Ku Klux Klan were a noble and wonderful thing, and that this was what America was really about, this kind of white unity. At this time, we also see massive voter suppression, and that voter suppression never really gets fixed. It's still pretty much the fact of American politics today. The US Army stops enforcing the vote in the former slave states, and the terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan take over and make it essentially impossible for people to vote. As a result, we have this situation where, despite the fact that women are granted the vote in 1920, in effect by this time, for the vast majority of black people, they don't effectively have the vote. And so, although in theory black women get the vote in 1920 along with white women, in practice when that happens, black women can't vote in most of the places where they live. And so people will sometimes say that, well, the 1920 19th Amendment only gave the vote to white women. It's not 100% true, but it's in lots of ways true for many black women in America. And what happens here is something quite amazing. We have this system of terrorist organizations like the Klan, but they take control of the government. They start to become the government. The laws that they want, the things that they want, like stopping black people from voting, like stopping black people and white people intermingling and so forth, become the law of the land. These are known as the Jim Crow laws. So that by 1930, you have government-enforced segregation in the former slave states. And so the governmental systems of these states have become institutionalized terrorist organizations. Depicted here is Ida B. Wells, who you've already learned about, who is one of the most important documenters of this process going on. The nadir, by the way, means the low points. This is often seen as the worst point for race relations, for racism in this country. During the time of the nadir, that with the development of myths about particularly black people in America, many of these myths are gendered. So in terms of men, you have the idea of black men as dangerous, as overly sexual, as unable to control themselves, as violent, as criminal, and particularly as rapists. And many, many black men are lynched under this myth, and this, as you saw in 13th, fuels the current state of incarceration. You also have the idea of the undeserving poor, the idea that black people are taking advantage of the state, that black people are being given something that they don't deserve. Again, this is very much still a common myth in America. In terms of women, you have the exoticization, the sexualization of black women. This is connected to colonization, what we talked about with Sajay Bartman, for example, and it's also connected to the use of black women as enslaved people for sex during slavery. And so the idea here is that they justify that by presenting black women similarly as unable to control themselves sexually, as being promiscuous, and so forth. We also see the development of blackness as entertainment, beginning with minstrelsy. The earliest minstrels are white people in blackface with those kind of big red lips and those kind of exaggerated, stereotypical, cartoonish features. But as it develops, black artists actually start to engage in minstrelsy as a way to become successful. And America begins to develop a bit of a kind of fascination with black people. There's this strange mix that on the one hand they're seen very negatively, they're kept down, they're stopped from participating in public life, they're stopped from voting. But on the other hand, black entertainers become very successful and become something that people are interested in, similarly with black athletes, right? So you begin to see, even while at the same time as for many black people things are as bad as they've ever been in terms of the ability to get wealth or success, there's a handful of black people that are becoming well-known public entertainers and figures. And this, of course, is still true today, where sports, where entertainment, where music and so forth, other places where there is some possibility for a very small number, but some black people to become celebrities, to become relatively rich, and so forth. And connected to this, of course, is the problem of cultural appropriation, of taking black creative work and repackaging it with white artists who then become more successful. There's also during this time the creation of a variety of stereotypes around black women, and Melissa Harris Perry has categorized these into 3 different stereotypes. The first is the mammy, displayed here in the poster, An Early Breakfast on a Diner. That's a pun. The mammy is maternal. She's a woman of size. She is very happy. Her job is to care for and feed and look after white babies and cook for the family and so forth, a job that she does with a kind of like folksy wisdom and love and so forth. The mammy is unsexualized, and in this depiction she's removed from her real family, so she's supposed to dedicate all of her time and love to someone else's, to a white person's babies and raising them, and no thought is given to the possibility or the very strong likelihood that she had a family of her own that she's being taken away from in order to do this work. It was another presentation of black people as happy in servitude in this case, as being, jovial and harmless, right? Again, if you've seen Gone with the Wind, the mammy character in that is a very compelling example of this. Then we have the sapphire. The sapphire has become the stereotype today of the angry black woman. Where this comes from is that the expectation under slavery and for white supremacists is that black people would stay in their place, that they would be quiet, that they would enjoy their position in society, that they wouldn't cause too much trouble. And a similar expectation existed around women, right? Women were supposed to stay in the home and they were supposed to obey their husbands and so forth. And what has happened is that some black women have demanded their rights that they are entitled to. They've demanded that they not be treated like doormats, that they not be excluded from public life. and that was so shocking to people's expectations of where their place was supposed to be, at the very bottom of society, and happy about it, that they portrayed these black women as being trouble, as being uppity, as being angry, as being unreasonable. And so the idea that black women should speak up for themselves, should advocate for themselves, has often been dismissed as being a sign that those women were too angry or unreasonable or too emotional or something. That's where the sapphire stereotype comes from. And finally, we have the Jezebel. Jezebel is a character who seduces men, right? So the idea here is she is a woman who is a seductress. She is presented often as a sex worker or an entertainer. The poster here of Boarding House Blues is an example of this. There were a bunch of movies made at the time presenting black women in this way. Black women have often been involved in sex work, as have all women, but have been presented in particular ways as sex workers. Again, kind of, there's a contradiction here where on the one hand, like, white America is treating black people as disposable, as useless, as awful, as below them. But on the other hand, there's a fascination, right? There's this desire for the exotic and so forth, and black women being presented in this way. You probably know about segregation, but I'm going to talk specifically about the case that made segregation legal, the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896, because it has an important fact about it. Plessy, who's depicted here, the guy on the left with the fancy beard, was Creole, meaning that he was of multiracial French, European, and African descent. He lived in New Orleans, and he was quite light-skinned. The Creole people in New Orleans existed in kind of a middle racial class. They were certainly not treated as poorly as people of pure African descent or people of English and African descent. They certainly weren't treated as well as white people either, but they kind of existed in the middle of society where they had some status comparatively, but not full status. And he worked with an organization to challenge segregation, specifically segregation on the streetcars. So what happened is he walked onto a streetcar and he refused to sit in the black streetcar, but instead got on the white streetcar. He actually had to stand up and announce to people that he was black. As I said, he was very light-skinned. He passed for white, and so they didn't recognize him as black when he did this protest. And in part, he was selected by the organization to show that this was ridiculous, right? That there isn't, in fact, black people and white people, but there's people all between. So it went to the court. The court famously ruled that separate is equal, that it was okay to have segregation. That wasn't overturned until Brown v. Board, led by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP 50 years later, 60 years later. But importantly, what I want to talk about here is the one-drop rule. So if you're going to have a law that says that only white people are allowed in one part of the streetcar and only black people are allowed in the other part, you have to be able to legally distinguish between who is black and who is white, which is not a trivial thing to do. As we know, there exists a full spectrum of people, from people who are very light-skinned to people who are very dark-skinned and everything in between, right? So how did they decide who was black and who wasn't? Well, they came up with this rule, the one-drop rule, that said if you have a single drop of African blood, then you count as black. So Plessy, who, as I said, was very light-skinned, who passed for white, counted as black in terms of the law could discriminate against him as a black man. And if you think about it, although we don't use the one-drop rule anymore, really, we do still think of blackness as being the kind of more defining racial feature of multiracial people. So think about Barack Obama, right? The president of the United States most recently. He is in ancestry as black as he is white, right? His father is African, his mother is of European descent. But he's never referred to, or almost never referred to, as the half-white president or, the white president, right? He's referred to as our first black president. We think of him as a black man, not as equally as much a black man as a white man. And this is generally true of people who are multiracial. Most of them are treated almost entirely as black, not as white, or as people of color, not as white people. There is colorism within the African American community. That's discrimination against people based on the darkness of their skin, which is a different thing from racism, although obviously overlapping, but we'll put that aside for the moment. But the point here is that the way this law and this way of thinking about race operates is to treat non-white racial groups as corrupting, as undermining the race, right? In order for white people to stay white, they have to kind of stay pure. They have to only marry other white people and have babies with other white people. But for black people, they can marry people of different races and still maintain a racial identity. In other words, the racial identity of white people is more precarious. It has to be protected, and in part this is what explains that incredible violence against the possibility of interracial marriage, against the possibility of people becoming pregnant and having multiracial babies. Of course, that's all going on at the same time as there is, rape of black women by white men on the plantations, and then going forward, which of course is having the same effect, but those white men are in no way punished for it. Okay, so what happens? During the Nadir, this situation has been created, as I said, where terrorism has basically taken control of the government in the South. Well, what do African Americans do? They get the fuck out of the South in huge numbers. So we can see in the chart here that in 1910, 83% of African Americans lived in the South. And then as the 20th century goes on, by 1970, it is, 60% of African Americans are living in the North. How does the North respond? Well, unfortunately, it does not respond by welcoming them with open arms and saying it's great that large numbers of African Americans are moving here. In some ways it was quite easy for the North not to be very racist in the 1900s because there just weren't really hardly any black people there, right? It's very easy not to engage in much racism if the only people around you are the same race as you. But as large numbers of black people moved to the North, they began to experience and face racism from white Northerners. This took all kinds of forms. One was what's known as sundown towns. You are probably all familiar with, and some of you probably come from towns in this state that are basically almost entirely white. Maybe there's a black family there, and if there is, they moved there relatively recently. This is not by coincidence. The reason this happened is that towns would use violence, would use laws to keep people from settling there who tried to move there. The expression comes from a phrase, "Don't let the sun go down on you" here, and then a word I'm not going to say. And if you think about it, what were most African Americans doing in 1910? And for work, they were mostly agricultural workers, right? They were mostly farmers. And so when they moved to the North, the jobs that they looked for were jobs in farm towns, were jobs doing farming, doing agricultural work. And those towns were often very hostile to them. And so as a result of that, they ended up concentrating in the cities. And so what you have is, in the South, you have African American population relatively spread out across rural and urban areas. in the north, you have these very strong concentrations of African Americans in a few big cities, right? Most of the black people in northern states are urban as opposed to rural. Going along with this, you have white flight. That's when black families move into a neighborhood, white families escaping by selling their houses and running away, in part because they were racially prejudiced, didn't want to live next door to them, but also this is kind of a self-perpetuating problem, because if white people believe other white people are going to move away, then what's going to happen? The value of the houses is going to drop, right? So then they want to sell their houses to get out to avoid losing their house value. So even the white people that weren't personally like offended by living next door to a black person were economically incentivized to escape from that neighborhood. So what you end up with is these concentrated urban neighborhoods. The jobs that were available there were largely manufacturing jobs. What happened in the 1980s then is the Ronald Reagan administration destroyed the manufacturing industry in this country, and that was devastating for those inner city areas. That's also when the CIA was letting drugs into the country, into those urban areas, and those combined to disastrous effects, as I'm sure you're familiar with. We also see the Northern Klan developing during this time in response to the movement there. And this brings us to the creation of institutionalized racism within liberal programs in the middle of the 20th century. Right? So here's a story that if you're from a white family, you might have heard. Your grandfather or perhaps great-grandfather, probably great-grandfather, served in World War II. He had never been to college. He was, a working-class guy. He came back, and on the GI Bill, he went to college. He was able to find a good job. He bought his own house. He then had kids, right, the baby boomers, and because he had been supported, he was able to, and his family, he was able to then send them to college, and that's how they joined the middle class. And there were a huge number of white Americans who moved from the incredible poverty of before World War II to relative middle class success, and this is how America built its large middle class in the 1950s and into the 1960s. And that was a result of government programs that helped people move from poverty to the middle class. So the liberal programs of FDR in particular, and then Eisenhower and LBJ. But these programs, at no point in the programs and the laws do they mention race explicitly. They don't actually have laws that specifically say that they're only for white people, but lots of the ways they were implemented were effectively limited to white people. So think about the GI Bill, right? One of the things it did is it enabled people to go to college. Well, the large majority of colleges at that time were segregated. They didn't allow black people in, and if they weren't segregated, they were certainly very racist in their admissions, right? And so having the government support you by helping pay for you to go to college is no good if no colleges will let you in. We do have the historically black colleges and universities in this country, but those are relatively elite schools. So they were good for, the few people that were particularly academically high achieving among African Americans. But for, the average African Americans that would go to state schools, they often just couldn't get in. So the fact that the government was supporting them didn't do them any good, while similarly kind of average white people were able to go to school and so forth, right? And then what happened with housing is what's known as redlining, and you're going to watch a video on the racial wealth gap that is going to explain this some more. But basically what was going on is the government was backing mortgages. Now, the government didn't want to back mortgages for houses that weren't going to gain value, right? That was a bad investment. So what they did is they contracted with real estate agents to have them decide which areas of town were good places to back a mortgage and which places were high risk. And so the realtors went through towns and literally drew red lines. You can see the map here under 1936 of what that looked like. That's a map of Indianapolis there. And so you can see the areas in red that they said were high risk, that you shouldn't give mortgages there, and then the yellow, blue, and green were better, that you could give mortgages there. So if you lived in those areas, the yellow, blue, and green, you could get a mortgage. If you lived in the red areas, you couldn't, a government-supported mortgage. Well, guess how they made that decision? The parts of town that looked good to these realtors, who of course were all white people, were the wider parts of town. The parts of town where more African Americans lived were often the parts of town that they thought, oh, those are risky, dangerous places to live, and so those were the ones they tended to redline. And the result was that people who lived there, mostly African Americans, couldn't get a mortgage supported by the government, and so stayed in those cycles of a lack of wealth, of poverty that had been created, whilst people who lived in the approved parts of the town were able to lift out of that poverty. So thank you. That's all for this week. Just to give you a sense of some of the ways that racial inequality has been created by policies, by the history in this country. Watch that Vox video on the racial wealth gap. Just a warning, the link to that is to the whole series. I don't expect you to watch all 10 hours of the series. It's from the season 1, and then look for the specific episode. There's also a video on Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks that I think is good fun. I skipped over the civil rights movement here. I assumed that you have learned a fair amount about that already. And that's all for this week. I will see you next week when we're going to talk about health. Thank you.